In the depths of winter, when the world surrenders to an endless white silence, there exists a hunger that defies all understanding. It is not the familiar ache of a missed meal or the gentle reminder of an empty stomach. This is something far more ancient, far more terrible, a hunger that grows with each feeding, that expands with every satisfaction, that transforms the very soul of those it touches. Deep in the boreal forests of North America, where the snow falls thick enough to muffle screams and the cold penetrates bone and marrow, the indigenous peoples have always known of this hunger. They have whispered its name around dying fires, passed down its warnings through generations of storytellers, and carried the weight of its terrible truth in their collective memory. The Algonquian-speaking nations, scattered across the vast wilderness from the Atlantic shores to the Great Lakes, from the Arctic tundra to the dense woodlands of the East, all share knowledge of the same dreadful entity. The Cree call it Wetiko, the Ojibwe know it as Wendigo, the Innu speak of the Achin. But regardless of the name, regardless of the tongue that speaks it, the meaning remains unchanged. It is the embodiment of insatiable consumption, the spirit of endless want, the creature born from the darkest violation of natural law. This is not merely another monster from folklore. This is not a simple boogeyman crafted to frighten children into obedience. The Wendigo represents something far more profound and far more terrifying. It is a mirror held up to humanity itself, reflecting our capacity for moral collapse, our potential for spiritual corruption, and our eternal struggle against the beast that lurks within our own hearts. To understand the Wendigo, we must first understand the world that gave birth to it. Picture, if you will, the vast expanse of the northern wilderness as it existed for countless centuries before the arrival of European settlers. An ocean of evergreen trees stretching beyond the horizon, broken only by the silver threads of countless rivers and the dark mirrors of 10,000 lakes. This was a landscape of profound beauty and equally profound danger, where survival demanded not just physical strength but spiritual wisdom. The Algonquian peoples who called this wilderness home were not merely survivors in this harsh environment. They were its partners, its children, bound to the land by relationships of reciprocity and respect that stretched back to the beginning of time itself. Their worldview was fundamentally animistic, recognizing consciousness and spirit in every aspect of the natural world. The wind had its own will, the rivers their own voices, the ancient trees their own memories. In this living landscape, human beings occupied a specific and carefully defined role. They were neither masters nor servants of nature, but participants in a complex web of relationships that demanded constant attention to balance and propriety. Every hunt required ceremony. Every harvest demanded gratitude. Every death called for specific rituals to ensure the proper passage of souls. The fundamental law governing this world was simple yet absolute. Take only what you need and never under any circumstances violate the sacred boundary between human and human. To consume the flesh of one's own kind was not merely taboo. It was a spiritual catastrophe that threatened to unravel the very fabric of reality itself. For the Algonquian nations, cannibalism represented the ultimate corruption, the final abandonment of everything that made one human. It was believed that such an act would invite something terrible into the world, something that would transform the transgressor into a vessel for an unnatural and unending hunger. This was not punishment in any conventional sense. It was transformation, a metamorphosis that stripped away humanity and left behind only appetite. The creature that emerged from this spiritual corruption was known by many names, but its essential nature remained constant across all the various traditions. The Wendigo was described as a giant towering above ordinary humans, its body stretched to impossible proportions by its insatiable hunger. Yet despite its immense size, it was invariably depicted as skeletal, emaciated, as if no amount of food could ever fill the void within its chest. Its appearance was the stuff of nightmares. Yellowed fangs protruded from a mouth that had long ago devoured its own lips. Its eyes glowed with a cold, predatory light, scanning the world not for beauty or meaning, but only for the next meal. Its skin was said to be gray as ash, stretched tight over protruding bones, and its hair was long and matted with the filth of its endless wandering. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Wendigo was not its physical form, but what that form represented. This was a being trapped in an impossible paradox. The more it consumed, the larger it grew. The larger it grew, the greater its hunger became. It was condemned to an eternity of starvation in the midst of endless feeding, forever seeking satisfaction that could never come. The transformation into a Wendigo was not instantaneous. It was described as a gradual process, a slow corruption that began in the mind and spread outward to consume the entire being. The first signs were subtle. A person might become withdrawn, antisocial, refusing to participate in the communal activities that form the backbone of indigenous life. They would complain of being cold, even in the warmest weather, as if something frozen had taken root in their chest. As the corruption progressed, the afflicted individual would lose interest in normal food. They would grow gaunt and hollow-eyed, existing in a state of perpetual hunger that no ordinary meal could satisfy. Family and friends would notice the change. The way the person's gaze had become predatory, the way they seemed to see other humans not as relatives and community members, but as potential prey. This was the Wendigo Sickness, a spiritual malady that threatened not just the individual, but the entire community. For the Algonquian peoples, mental illness was not viewed through the lens of individual pathology, but as a disruption in the spiritual equilibrium that connected all living things. The Wendigo represented the ultimate disruption, a complete severing of the bonds that held society together. The shamans and medicine people of the various tribes possessed specific knowledge and rituals for dealing with such spiritual crises. They understood that the Wendigo was not merely a physical threat, but a manifestation of broken relationships, violated taboos, and spiritual imbalance. Their methods of treatment reflected this understanding, focusing not just on the afflicted individual, but on the restoration of harmony within the entire community. Yet despite all their wisdom and power, there were cases where the shamans arrived too late, where the corruption had progressed beyond the point of healing. In such instances, the person was considered to be already dead, their human soul consumed by the malevolent spirit that now animated their body. What remained was no longer a community member to be healed, but a monster to be destroyed. The winter months were when the Wendigo was most active, most dangerous. This was the season of scarcity, when food stores ran low and the hunting became difficult. It was during these long, dark months that the temptation was greatest, when starving families might be driven to consider the unthinkable. The Wendigo represented the ultimate warning against giving in to such desperation, a reminder that some prices were too high to pay even for survival itself. But the Wendigo was more than just a cautionary tale about cannibalism. It embodied a broader critique of excessive consumption, of greed, of the kind of selfish accumulation that threatened the delicate balance upon which indigenous communities depended. A person who hoarded resources while others went hungry, who took more than their share from the common stores, who put personal gain above communal welfare, was said to be acting like a Wendigo. This understanding of the Wendigo as a symbol of destructive consumption has taken on new relevance in our modern world. Indigenous scholars and activists have begun to use the term Wetiko, a closely related concept, to describe the spiritual sickness they see in contemporary industrial civilization. From this perspective, the endless pursuit of profit, the relentless exploitation of natural resources, the inability to find satisfaction despite unprecedented material abundance, all represent manifestations of the same spiritual corruption that the Wendigo embodied. The creature's association with winter was not merely seasonal. Winter represented death, scarcity, the time when the thin veneer of civilization was most likely to crack and reveal the beast beneath. It was the season when communities were most isolated, most vulnerable, most likely to face the kinds of desperate choices that could lead to spiritual corruption. Yet winter was also a time of profound spiritual significance for the Algonquian peoples. It was the season of storytelling, when the elders would pass down the ancient knowledge to the younger generations. The long, dark nights were filled with tales that served multiple purposes: entertainment, education, and spiritual instruction. The stories of the Wendigo were among the most important of these teachings, for they addressed fundamental questions about the nature of humanity itself. What separates human beings from animals? What are the boundaries that must never be crossed? How do we maintain our humanity in the face of extreme hardship? These were not abstract philosophical questions for people living on the edge of survival. They were practical matters of life and death. Questions that might need to be answered in the depths of a harsh winter when food ran out and desperation set in. The Wendigo served as a spiritual boundary marker, a clear delineation between the human and the inhuman. It represented the point of no return, the line that, once crossed, led inevitably to spiritual destruction. But it also served as a teaching tool, a way of exploring the psychological and spiritual dynamics of extreme situations without actually experiencing them. The stories served another crucial purpose as well. They provided a framework for understanding and responding to genuine psychological crises. When someone in the community began to exhibit the warning signs of spiritual corruption, the traditional knowledge offered both diagnosis and treatment. The shamans possessed specific rituals for cleansing the soul, for driving out malevolent influences, for restoring the proper balance between the human and spirit worlds. These healing ceremonies were elaborate affairs, often lasting for days and involving the entire community. They recognized that spiritual sickness was not an individual problem but a communal one, requiring collective effort to address. The patient would be surrounded by family and friends, enveloped in songs and prayers, bathed in the smoke of sacred medicines, and gradually drawn back into the web of human relationships that defined their identity. But not every case could be healed. The oral traditions speak of times when the corruption had progressed too far, when the person had already crossed the threshold from human to monster. In such instances, the community faced a terrible choice. They could not allow the Wendigo to remain among them, for its very presence threatened to spread the spiritual contagion to others. Yet the creature had once been one of their own, someone they had loved and cherished. The decision to destroy a Wendigo was never made lightly. It required the consensus of the elders, the blessing of the shamans, and the participation of the entire community. It was understood not as murder but as a mercy killing, a final act of love for someone who was already dead in all the ways that mattered. The ritual destruction of the Wendigo was also a form of spiritual warfare, a battle to prevent the corruption from spreading further. These were not mere stories told around campfires. They were living traditions that shaped behavior, influenced decision-making, and provided meaning in the face of incomprehensible suffering. The Wendigo was real in the truest sense, not as a physical creature stalking through the forest, but as a spiritual force that could manifest whenever human beings abandoned their essential humanity. The arrival of European colonizers brought profound disruption to this ancient worldview. The missionaries who followed in the wake of the fur traders and soldiers carried with them a very different understanding of evil, one that located supernatural malevolence in external demons rather than internal corruption. They dismissed the indigenous beliefs as primitive superstition, failing to recognize the sophisticated psychological and spiritual insights embedded in the traditional teachings. Yet the Wendigo did not disappear with the coming of Christianity. Instead, it adapted, evolved, found new forms of expression in the hybrid culture that emerged from the collision of two worlds. The creature began to appear in the reports of government officials, the journals of explorers, the testimonies given in colonial courtrooms. What had once been a purely spiritual entity became entangled with legal definitions of insanity, criminal responsibility, and public safety. The most famous of these documented cases occurred in the late 19th century, when a Cree trapper named Swift Runner was arrested, tried, and executed for the murder and cannibalism of his own family. The case became a sensation in the Canadian press, with reporters struggling to make sense of a crime that seemed to defy rational explanation. Swift Runner himself claimed that he had been possessed by a Wendigo spirit, that he was not responsible for his actions, that something else had been using his body to commit these terrible acts. The colonial authorities had no framework for understanding such claims. They saw only a man who had committed horrific crimes and needed to be punished accordingly. But for the indigenous communities who followed the trial, Swift Runner's fate represented something far more complex and tragic. He was not a criminal in their understanding, but a victim of spiritual forces beyond his control. Someone who had been failed by his community's ability to provide the healing he needed. The case highlighted the fundamental disconnect between indigenous and European approaches to understanding human behavior, where the colonizers saw individual pathology requiring legal punishment. The traditional worldview recognized spiritual crisis requiring communal healing. The Wendigo had become a casualty of cultural collision, reduced from a profound teaching about the nature of humanity to a crude legal category. But the deeper meaning of the Wendigo could not be so easily dismissed. Even as the traditional ways of life came under increasing pressure, even as the old languages were suppressed and the ancient ceremonies banned, the essential truth embodied by the creature continued to resonate. The warning against excessive consumption, against the kind of selfish accumulation that destroys community bonds, remained as relevant as ever. In fact, some indigenous thinkers began to see the colonial project itself as a manifestation of Wendigo consciousness. The relentless appetite for land, resources, and wealth that drove European expansion displayed all the characteristics of the spiritual corruption described in the old stories. Like the mythical creature, colonial society seemed incapable of satisfaction, always hungry for more, growing larger and more destructive with each feeding. This understanding gained particular urgency during the Industrial Revolution, when the pace of environmental destruction accelerated dramatically. The clearing of ancient forests, the poisoning of rivers, the slaughter of vast animal herds, all seemed to reflect the same insatiable hunger that the Wendigo embodied. The creature had not disappeared from the world. It had simply found new forms of expression, new bodies to inhabit, new ways to manifest its endless appetite. The psychological insights embedded in the Wendigo tradition also proved remarkably prescient. Long before European psychiatry developed theories about psychosis, dissociation, and trauma, indigenous healers had recognized that extreme stress could fundamentally alter human consciousness. They understood that starvation, isolation, and desperation could break down the psychological barriers that normally constrain behavior, allowing buried impulses to emerge with devastating consequences. The concept of Wendigo psychosis entered the medical literature in the early 20th century. As anthropologists and psychiatrists began to study what they termed culture-bound syndromes, they documented cases of individuals who exhibited all the classic symptoms described in the traditional stories: social withdrawal, paranoid ideation, violent fantasies involving cannibalism, and profound feelings of cold and emptiness. Yet even as these researchers attempted to medicalize the phenomenon, they struggled to explain its cultural specificity. Why did this particular form of psychosis seem to occur primarily among indigenous peoples of the northern forests? What was it about the traditional worldview that made people susceptible to this specific constellation of symptoms? The answers, they gradually realized, lay not in individual pathology but in the broader social and spiritual context that gave the Wendigo its meaning. The creature served as a kind of cultural lightning rod, attracting and channeling the psychological pressures generated by extreme circumstances. When traditional social supports broke down, when the usual sources of meaning and identity were disrupted, when people found themselves cut off from the relationships that defined their humanity. The Wendigo provided a framework for understanding what was happening to them. This insight has taken on new relevance in our contemporary world, where rates of depression, anxiety, and social isolation continue to climb, despite unprecedented material prosperity. The Wendigo's message about the spiritual dangers of excessive consumption, about the emptiness that lies at the heart of purely materialistic existence, speaks directly to the malaise of modern life. The stories that emerged from these documented encounters reveal a pattern that would become increasingly familiar to colonial authorities throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Time and again, they found themselves confronting cases that defied their understanding of criminal behavior. Instances where indigenous people claim to have been possessed by supernatural forces, driven to acts of violence by entities beyond their control. The officials struggled to categorize these incidents within their existing legal frameworks. Was this madness? Religious delusion? Elaborate deception? They had no conceptual vocabulary for understanding claims of spiritual possession. No way to process the idea that a person might become a vessel for malevolent forces while retaining enough consciousness to recognize and describe their own transformation. Yet the consistency of the accounts was troubling. Across vast distances and diverse tribal communities, the same story emerged again and again. A person would become withdrawn and antisocial. They would complain of an unnatural cold that seemed to emanate from within their own body. They would lose interest in normal food while developing an obsessive fascination with human flesh. Their family would notice changes in their behavior, their speech, their very presence, as if something else was looking out through their eyes. The transformation was described as gradual but inexorable. The afflicted individual would begin to see other people not as relatives or community members, but as potential prey. They would speak of an overwhelming hunger that no ordinary meal could satisfy, a gnawing emptiness that seemed to grow larger and more demanding with each passing day. Their physical appearance would change as well, becoming gaunt and hollow-eyed, as if something was consuming them from within. What made these cases particularly disturbing was the lucidity with which many of the afflicted individuals could describe their own condition. They were not raving madmen, lost in incoherent delusion. They could articulate exactly what was happening to them, could recognize the moral horror of their desires while feeling powerless to resist them. They spoke of being passengers in their own bodies, watching helplessly as something else took control of their actions. The colonial authorities found such testimony deeply unsettling. It was easier to dismiss claims of supernatural possession when they came from people who seemed clearly deranged. But how do you categorize someone who can calmly and rationally explain that they are being consumed by an ancient evil? Who can describe in clinical detail the process of their own spiritual corruption? The medical establishment of the time had few tools for understanding such phenomena. The emerging field of psychiatry was still heavily influenced by religious concepts of moral insanity and spiritual weakness. Mental illness was often viewed as a failure of character rather than a medical condition. and the idea that cultural beliefs might shape the expression of psychological distress was largely foreign to European-trained physicians. Yet some observers began to recognize patterns that suggested a more complex reality. The Wendigo cases seemed to cluster around periods of extreme social stress, often following disruptions to traditional ways of life. The construction of railroads, the establishment of reservations, the forced attendance at residential schools, all created conditions of cultural trauma that seemed to trigger these spiritual crises. The connection between cultural disruption and psychological breakdown was not lost on some of the more perceptive colonial administrators. They began to see the Wendigo cases not as isolated incidents of individual madness, but as symptoms of a broader social pathology, manifestations of the profound disorientation that resulted from the collision of two radically different worldviews. This understanding led to a gradual shift in how such cases were handled. Rather than simply prosecuting the afflicted individuals as criminals, authorities began to recognize them as victims of circumstances beyond their control. Some were committed to asylums rather than prisons, though the treatment they received there was often little better than incarceration. The indigenous communities themselves developed their own responses to these crises. Traditional healers worked to adapt their ancient practices to the new realities of colonial life, finding ways to address spiritual sickness even as the old ceremonies were being suppressed by government policy. They recognized that the Wendigo was thriving in the chaos of cultural breakdown, feeding on the despair and disconnection that characterized life on the margins of colonial society. These healers understood something that the colonial authorities missed. The Wendigo was not just an individual pathology but a social phenomenon. It emerged from broken relationships, from the severing of the bonds that connected people to their land, their community, and their ancestral traditions. To heal the afflicted individual, you had to address the broader context of cultural trauma that had created the conditions for possession. The traditional healing ceremonies were elaborate affairs that involved the entire community. They recognized that spiritual sickness was contagious, that it could spread from person to person through the invisible networks of relationship and meaning that bound societies together. The goal was not just to cure the individual patient, but to strengthen the entire social fabric, to rebuild the connections that had been damaged by colonial interference. These ceremonies often lasted for days, involving complex rituals of purification, songs that had been passed down through generations, and the burning of sacred medicines whose smoke was believed to cleanse both the physical and spiritual atmosphere. The patient would be surrounded by family and friends, held within a web of love and support that was itself a form of medicine. The healing process required the active participation of everyone present. Each person had a role to play, whether through singing, drumming, offering prayers, or simply maintaining the sacred space through their presence and attention. The ceremony was understood as a collective effort to restore balance, to repair the damage that had been done to the spiritual ecology of the community. But even these powerful healing traditions had their limits. There were cases where the corruption had progressed too far, where the person had already crossed the threshold from human to monster. In such instances, the community faced an agonizing choice: They could not allow the Wendigo to remain among them, for its very presence threatened to spread the spiritual contagion to others. The decision to destroy a fully transformed Wendigo was never made lightly. It required extensive consultation among the elders, careful divination to confirm that all other options had been exhausted, and the blessing of the spiritual leaders who would guide the community through this terrible necessity. It was understood not as an act of vengeance or punishment, but as a mercy killing. A final expression of love for someone who was already dead in all the ways that mattered. The actual destruction of a Wendigo was surrounded by elaborate ritual precautions. The creature was believed to possess supernatural strength and cunning, making it extremely dangerous to approach. Special weapons were prepared, often blessed by the shamans and inscribed with protective symbols. The hunters who volunteered for this grim task underwent purification ceremonies to protect them from spiritual contamination. The battle itself was understood as more than a physical confrontation. It was a form of spiritual warfare, a struggle between the forces of order and chaos, between the human and the inhuman. The victory was never guaranteed, for the Wendigo was fighting not just for its own survival, but for the right to spread its corruption to others. Even after the creature was killed, the danger was not over. The body had to be completely destroyed, often by fire, to prevent the malevolent spirit from finding another host. The ashes were scattered in remote locations far from human habitation, to ensure that no trace of the corruption remained to threaten future generations. The psychological toll of these encounters was enormous. The hunters who participated in the destruction of a Wendigo often required extensive spiritual healing afterward, for they had been exposed to forces that could damage the soul itself. The entire community needed time to recover from the trauma of having harbored such evil in their midst. These traditional responses to the Wendigo phenomenon reveal a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between individual psychology and social environment. Long before European psychiatry developed concepts like collective trauma and cultural pathology, indigenous healers recognized that mental illness was often a symptom of broader social dysfunction. They understood that the Wendigo was not just a random occurrence, but a predictable response to certain kinds of stress and disruption. When communities were isolated from their traditional support systems, when people were cut off from the relationships and practices that gave their lives meaning, when the normal channels for expressing and processing grief and trauma were blocked, the conditions were ripe for spiritual corruption. This insight has profound implications for our understanding of mental health in the modern world. The rising rates of depression, anxiety, and social isolation that characterize contemporary life bear striking similarities to the conditions that traditional healers associated with Wendigo possession. The same sense of emptiness, the same insatiable hunger for something that can never be satisfied, the same disconnection from sources of meaning and community. The parallels become even more striking when we consider the way modern consumer culture mirrors the essential characteristics of the Wendigo itself. The creature was defined by its insatiable appetite, its inability to find satisfaction no matter how much it consumed. It grew larger and hungrier with each feeding, trapped in an endless cycle of want and temporary gratification. This description could easily apply to the dynamics of contemporary capitalism. With its emphasis on endless growth, constant consumption, and the perpetual creation of new desires to replace those that have been temporarily satisfied. Like the Wendigo, our economic system seems incapable of recognizing limits, always demanding more resources, more markets, more opportunities for expansion. Indigenous scholars and activists have begun to use this comparison explicitly, arguing that the Wendigo has not disappeared from the world, but has simply found new forms of expression. They point to the environmental destruction caused by industrial development, the social fragmentation produced by urbanization and individualism, the spiritual emptiness that characterizes so much of modern life, as evidence that the ancient evil has merely adapted to new circumstances. From this perspective, the Wendigo is not a relic of primitive superstition, but a prophetic warning about the dangers of unchecked consumption and spiritual disconnection. The creature serves as a mirror, reflecting back to us the logical endpoint of a way of life based on endless accumulation and the denial of natural limits. This understanding has given new urgency to efforts to preserve and revitalize indigenous knowledge systems. Traditional teachings about balance, reciprocity, and the interconnectedness of all life are increasingly seen not as quaint cultural artifacts, but as essential wisdom for navigating the crises of the modern world. The Wendigo stories offer particular insights into the psychology of extreme situations and the factors that can lead to moral collapse. They recognize that human beings are not inherently good or evil, but are shaped by the circumstances in which they find themselves. Under extreme stress, when normal social supports break down and survival becomes uncertain, even decent people can be driven to acts they would never have imagined possible. This understanding is reflected in the traditional emphasis on prevention rather than punishment. Rather than simply condemning those who succumb to spiritual corruption, indigenous communities focused on identifying and addressing the conditions that made such corruption possible. They recognized that everyone was vulnerable, that the line between human and monster was thinner than most people wanted to admit. The stories also reveal a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between individual and collective well-being. The Wendigo was never just a personal problem, but a threat to the entire community. Its hunger was contagious, its corruption capable of spreading from person to person through the invisible networks of relationship and meaning that bound societies together. This recognition led to collective responses that involved everyone in the healing process. The community as a whole had to take responsibility for creating the conditions that allowed spiritual sickness to flourish, and the community as a whole had to participate in the work of restoration and healing. These insights remain relevant in our contemporary context, where individualistic approaches to mental health often fail to address the social and cultural factors that contribute to psychological distress. The Wendigo tradition suggests that healing requires not just individual therapy, but collective action to address the underlying conditions that make people vulnerable to spiritual corruption. The creature's association with winter and isolation also speaks to fundamental truths about human psychology. We are social beings, dependent on connection and community for our psychological well-being. When those connections are severed, when we are cut off from the relationships and practices that give our lives meaning, we become vulnerable to forces that can fundamentally alter our consciousness. The long, dark months of winter served as a natural laboratory for exploring these dynamics. Communities were forced into close quarters for extended periods, testing the bonds that held them together. Resources became scarce, requiring careful management and equitable distribution. The normal rhythms of life were disrupted, creating stress and uncertainty that could trigger psychological crises. In this context, the Wendigo stories served multiple functions. They provided entertainment during the long nights, offering dramatic narratives that helped pass the time. They served as educational tools, teaching young people about the importance of sharing, cooperation, and mutual support. And they functioned as psychological preparation, helping community members understand and respond to the kinds of crises that might emerge during periods of extreme stress. The stories also served as a form of social control, reinforcing cultural norms and values through the power of narrative. The threat of becoming a Wendigo provided a powerful deterrent against antisocial behavior, while the promise of community support for those who remain true to traditional values offered positive reinforcement for cooperation and mutual aid. But perhaps most importantly, the Wendigo stories provided a framework for understanding and responding to genuine psychological crises. They offered a vocabulary for describing experiences that might otherwise be incomprehensible, a set of concepts and practices for addressing spiritual emergencies, and a model for collective action in the face of individual breakdown. This framework has proven remarkably durable, adapting to new circumstances while retaining its essential insights about the relationship between individual psychology and social environment. Even as traditional ways of life have been disrupted by colonization and modernization, the core wisdom embedded in the Wendigo tradition continues to offer guidance for understanding and addressing the spiritual crises of our time. The creature's evolution in popular culture reflects this ongoing relevance. From its origins in indigenous oral tradition, the Wendigo has migrated into literature, film, and other forms of mass media, where it continues to serve as a symbol of the dangers of unchecked consumption and spiritual corruption. Yet this migration has not been without costs. The commercialization of indigenous imagery and concepts often strips away their original context and meaning, reducing complex spiritual teachings to simple entertainment. The Wendigo has become a monster in horror movies, a creature to be feared and defeated rather than understood as a warning about the potential for moral collapse that exists within all human communities. This transformation reflects broader patterns of cultural appropriation and commodification that have characterized the relationship between indigenous and settler societies. Sacred knowledge becomes secular entertainment. Profound teachings about the nature of humanity are reduced to jump scares and special effects. Yet even this cultural dilution cannot entirely destroy the power of the original teaching. The Wendigo endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience, something that transcends cultural boundaries and historical periods. The fear of moral collapse, the anxiety about what we might become under extreme circumstances, The recognition that civilization is a thin veneer barely containing forces we do not fully understand. In our modern world, where global supply chains can be disrupted by a single event, where social media algorithms can manipulate our deepest desires, where climate change threatens the stability we have taken for granted, the lessons of the Wendigo feel more relevant than ever. We live in an age of unprecedented abundance, yet rates of anxiety, depression, and social isolation continue to climb. We have more ways to connect with others than any previous generation, yet many people report feeling more alone than ever before. The parallels to the conditions that traditional healers associated with spiritual corruption are impossible to ignore. The breakdown of community bonds, the emphasis on individual achievement over collective well-being, the constant pressure to consume more and achieve more, all create the kind of spiritual emptiness that the Wendigo was said to exploit. Consider the modern phenomenon of addiction, whether to substances, technology, or consumption itself. The pattern is remarkably similar to what the old stories described: an insatiable hunger that grows stronger with each feeding, a progressive disconnection from family and community, a gradual loss of the very qualities that make us human. The addict, like the Wendigo, becomes trapped in an endless cycle of want and temporary satisfaction, always searching for something that can never truly fill the void within. The digital age has created new forms of this ancient hunger. Social media platforms are designed to generate endless scrolling, endless seeking for validation and connection that can never quite satisfy. The dopamine hits from likes and shares create a neurological pattern that mirrors the traditional descriptions of Wendigo possession. A constant craving for more, a gradual numbing to normal pleasures, and increasing isolation from genuine human connection. Even our relationship with food has taken on Wendigo-like characteristics. Industrial agriculture treats the natural world as a resource to be consumed rather than a living system to be respected. Factory farming reduces sentient beings to mere commodities, breaking the ancient bonds of reciprocity between humans and the animals that sustain us. The obesity epidemic in wealthy nations represents a form of spiritual starvation in the midst of material abundance, a desperate search for satisfaction through consumption that can never truly nourish the soul. The environmental crisis itself bears the hallmarks of Wendigo consciousness: the relentless extraction of resources, the poisoning of air and water, the destruction of entire ecosystems in service of short-term profit, all reflect the same insatiable appetite that characterized the mythical creature. Like the Wendigo, industrial civilization seems incapable of recognizing limits, always demanding more, growing larger and hungrier with each feeding. Indigenous activists and scholars have been among the most articulate voices warning about these patterns. They point to the traditional teachings as offering not just diagnosis but potential cure, ancient wisdom about how to live in balance with natural systems and each other. The ceremonies and practices that once healed Wendigo possession may hold keys to addressing the spiritual crises of our time. The emphasis on community healing rather than individual treatment offers a radical alternative to dominant approaches to mental health and social problems, instead of focusing solely on individual pathology. Traditional approaches recognize that healing must address the broader social and environmental contexts that create conditions for spiritual corruption. The seasonal nature of the Wendigo's power also offers insights into the rhythms of psychological well-being. The creature was most active during winter, the season of scarcity and isolation. Modern life, with its artificial lighting and climate control, has largely eliminated these natural cycles, creating a kind of perpetual summer that may actually increase our vulnerability to the spiritual emptiness the Wendigo represents. Some researchers have begun to explore connections between seasonal affective disorder, social isolation, and the traditional descriptions of Wendigo sickness. The symptoms are remarkably similar: depression, social withdrawal, loss of interest in normal activities, and in extreme cases, violent fantasies and antisocial behavior. The traditional emphasis on storytelling as a form of medicine also remains relevant. The Wendigo stories served as more than entertainment. They were tools for psychological preparation, helping community members understand and respond to spiritual crises. In our age of fractured narratives and competing worldviews, we may have lost access to the kind of shared stories that can guide us through difficult times. The creature's paradoxical nature, growing larger and hungrier with each feeding, offers a profound metaphor for understanding various forms of addiction and compulsive behavior, whether applied to substance abuse, consumer culture, or the pursuit of power and wealth. The Wendigo pattern reveals itself again and again. The more we consume, the emptier we become. The more we take, the less satisfied we feel. This understanding suggests that healing requires not just individual willpower, but fundamental changes in the social and economic systems that create conditions for spiritual corruption. The traditional emphasis on community support, shared resources, and collective responsibility offers a model for addressing these systemic issues. The Wendigo's association with cannibalism takes on new meaning when viewed metaphorically. In indigenous understanding, consuming one's own kind meant more than literal cannibalism. It represented any form of predation that destroyed the bonds of kinship and community. In our modern context, this might include economic systems that allow some to profit from the suffering of others, political structures that pit communities against each other, or cultural practices that treat human beings as disposable resources. The traditional healing ceremonies for Wendigo possession required the active participation of the entire community. Everyone had a role to play in the restoration of balance and the healing of the afflicted individual. This collective approach to healing offers a stark contrast to the individualistic focus of modern therapy and medicine. The ceremonies themselves were elaborate affairs, often lasting for days and involving complex rituals of purification, prayer, and communal support. The patient was not treated as a passive recipient of care, but as an active participant in their own healing, surrounded by family and friends who shared responsibility for their recovery. These practices recognized that spiritual sickness was contagious, that it could spread through communities like a disease, but they also understood that healing was equally contagious, that the restoration of one person's spiritual health could strengthen the entire social fabric. The traditional knowledge keepers who specialized in treating Wendigo possession were not just individual healers, but repositories of collective wisdom about the nature of spiritual crisis and recovery. They understood the complex interplay between individual psychology, social environment, and spiritual forces that could lead to possession or healing. Their methods were based on centuries of observation and experience, refined through generations of practice and passed down through carefully maintained oral traditions. This knowledge was not abstract theory, but practical wisdom tested in the crucible of real human suffering and recovery. The decline of these traditional knowledge systems represents more than just cultural loss. It may have left us vulnerable to forms of spiritual corruption that previous generations knew how to recognize and treat. The rising rates of mental illness, addiction, and social fragmentation in modern societies suggest that we have lost access to essential wisdom about maintaining psychological and spiritual health. Yet the core insights of the Wendigo tradition remain accessible to those willing to look beyond the surface manifestations of the stories. The emphasis on balance, reciprocity, and community support offers timeless guidance for addressing the spiritual crises of any age. The creature's ultimate fate in the traditional stories also offers hope. The Wendigo was not an invincible force, but a corruption that could be healed through proper understanding and collective action. The same spiritual forces that could transform a human into a monster could also restore them to wholeness, given the right conditions and community support. This understanding suggests that the spiritual crises of our time, however overwhelming they may seem, are not insurmountable. The wisdom embedded in the Wendigo stories offers both warning and promise. Warning about the dangers of spiritual corruption, and promise that healing is possible when communities come together to address the root causes of suffering. The stories remind us that we are not helpless in the face of forces that would reduce us to our basest instincts. We have within us and within our communities the capacity for resistance, healing, and transformation. But this capacity must be cultivated through conscious effort, supported by social structures that prioritize collective well-being over individual gain. As we face the challenges of the 21st century, the Wendigo stands as both warning and guide. It warns us about the spiritual dangers of unchecked consumption, social fragmentation, and disconnection from the natural world. But it also offers guidance about how to maintain our humanity in the face of forces that would strip it away. The hunger that never ends is not an inevitable fate, but a choice. We can choose to feed the endless appetite that consumes everything in its path. Or we can choose to cultivate the kinds of relationships and practices that nourish the soul. We can allow ourselves to be isolated and consumed by forces beyond our control. Or we can come together as communities to create conditions that support spiritual health and collective well-being. The Wendigo reminds us that we are not merely individual consumers or competitors, but members of interconnected communities whose health depends on our ability to maintain balance and reciprocity with each other and with the natural world. In recognizing this truth, we find not just the key to understanding an ancient legend, but perhaps the path to healing the spiritual wounds of our modern age. The creature that stalks through the winter forests of indigenous imagination continues to walk among us, wearing new faces but driven by the same ancient hunger. Whether we become its victims or find the strength to resist its corruption depends on our willingness to remember the old wisdom and apply it to the challenges of our time. In the end, the Wendigo is not something outside ourselves to be feared and defeated, but something within ourselves to be understood and transformed. It is the shadow side of human nature, the potential for corruption that exists within every heart. By acknowledging this shadow and working together to address the conditions that allow it to flourish, we honor both the wisdom of those who first told these stories and our own responsibility to future generations. The hunger that never ends can be satisfied, but not through consumption. It can only be healed through connection, through community, through remembering what it truly means to be human. In this remembering, the ancient warnings become modern wisdom, and the old stories reveal themselves as maps for navigating the challenges that lie ahead. The Wendigo's tale is not finished. It continues to unfold in every choice we make about how to live, how to relate to each other and to the world around us. We are all part of this story, all participants in the ongoing struggle between the forces of consumption and the forces of connection, between the hunger that devours and the love that heals. May we have the wisdom to choose well and the courage to face whatever hungers may come, armed with the ancient knowledge that even the deepest spiritual corruption can be healed when communities come together with shared purpose and mutual care. In this lies our hope, and perhaps our salvation.